Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy for today's special event featuring an interview of the Baker Institute's honorary chair, James A. Baker III, by Talmage Boston. Talmage, as you all know, is a distinguished lawyer who has written extensively on the importance of the legal profession. His detailed biography is in your program. His 2012 book, Raising the Bar, The Crucial Role of the Lawyer in Society, profiles our honorary chair as a lawyer-statesman. From my own experience working with Secretary Baker over the years, I can say that legal training and experience are powerful tools for buttressing the strategic thinking and negotiation skills necessary for successful diplomacy. When Rice students ask me what I would do differently looking back on my career, I would say I would have gone to law school after having to suffer under interminable moments when Secretary Baker would correct my telegrams. Given the many complex crises occurring around the world that we're all painfully aware of, we need more Americans to consider public service as a challenging and rewarding career path. I hope that this afternoon's conversation, which will be transcribed for a chapter in Talmage's forthcoming book, inspires more of our youth to opt for serving their country. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming James A. Baker III and Talmage Boston.
Thank you very much. It's quite an honor to be here. My upcoming book is entitled Cross-Examining History, and it's really a book about presidential history with major presidential historians and presidential insiders who I've interviewed on stage, and then the interviews are transcribed and edited. And I've identified the 20 most significant presidents, and so we have a major historian about each and an insider for some of the recent presidents. So we're going to be talking today about the presidencies of Ronald Reagan and George Herbert Walker Bush and the important role that Secretary Baker played in the 12 years of those presidencies. So let's begin with the presidency of Ronald Reagan, Secretary Baker. Now, even though you were on the opposite side of him in the Republican race in 1976, when you were leading Gerald Ford's campaign, and also on the opposite side of him for the first 5 months of 1980, when you were leading George H.W. Bush's campaign, Reagan obviously saw something in you that he liked. Even though you were a, quote, moderate Republican, while Reagan's followers were the, quote, true believers of the far right. But then after George Bush dropped out of the race in May of 1980, Ronald Reagan asked you first to be the head of coaching him for the presidential debate, and then, of course, later named you as his White House Chief of Staff, arguably the most important position in his administration. So my question is, as Ronald Reagan kept calling your number, how did you read the tea leaves about Reagan's commitment to the true believers on the far right?
Well, I really wasn't too concerned about his views of the true believers on the far right after he asked me to be his White House Chief of Staff, and I said yes. I knew that we would have an administration, at least in part, that was oriented toward getting things done and towards what the far right believed was a dirty word called pragmatism. My view of pragmatism is getting stuff done without sacrificing principle. And I think Ronald Reagan was very much a principled pragmatist. I can't tell you how many times I would be with him in the Oval, just the two of us, talking about some effort we had up on Capitol Hill, and he would look at me and he would say, Jim, I'd rather get 80% of what I want than go over the cliff with my flag flying. People think he was an ideologue. He wasn't. I mean, he was very conservative. He held very firmly held beliefs that were strongly conservative, but he was a pragmatist, and he understood that we judge our presidents on the basis of what they can get accomplished, how much of their programs and policies they can get through the Congress. So he was very much a pragmatist, and I never once spent any time worrying about his commitment to the so-called far right. I mean, he was quite conservative, but he understood that that's the way we judge our presidents. He used to tell a joke, and nobody was a better joke teller than Ronald Reagan. He used to tell a joke occasionally about somebody would be interviewing him and talking about how conservative his administration was and how far over on the right they were. And Reagan would look at him and say, yeah, he said, you know, sometimes in our administration, our right hand doesn't know what our far right hand is doing.
Now, shortly into his presidency, in May of 1981, President Reagan was shot by an assassin and then obviously survived to lead the country until January of 1989. In the last couple of months, there's been a major uproar arising over Fox pundit Bill O'Reilly's best-selling nonfiction book, which purports to be history, called Killing Reagan, which is premised on the idea that after President Reagan was shot, he went into a mental decline that lasted the remainder of his presidency. Now, the book has been discredited by many, but it does raise the age issue. And so my question is, was there any time after President Reagan regained his health following the shooting that you ever sensed any mental decline at all until he left office in January of '89?
The answer is no. Never. Never. I don't buy that. I don't buy the argument that somehow in the latter years of his presidency he was suffering from the creeping effects of Alzheimer's. It's just not, in my view, not accurate, not correct. I never noticed anything, and I was his Treasury Secretary for those years, up until July of '88 when I left to run George H.W. Bush's campaign for president. I was his Treasury Secretary, and I was with him not as much as I was when I was Chief of Staff, when I was at his right hand every day, but I was with him quite frequently, and I never noticed any of that. The first time I noticed anything, I was talking to John Williams in the car on the way over here, really I think was 1993. When I went to an event, it was an RNC. We had just been involuntarily retired from public service, and I went to an event that the RNC had given, and he was there. And I walked up to the dais to say hello, and I remember Nancy saying as I came up, stuck my hand, I said, "It's Jim Baker, Ronnie," and that was the first time. But that was way down in '93. So he left office in '89, and I don't remember when he wrote his letter to the American people.
It was '94.
'94?
Yeah.
Well, that's the first time I ever noticed anything. That was '93.
Mm-hmm. Now, as White House Chief of Staff, you've said in your book that a big part of your job was to advise the president on policy questions through your political prism. Now, in H.W. Brand's new biography of Reagan, he says you definitely did that for President Reagan when there was an effort to pursue Social Security reform in '81, shortly after he came back from the shooting, where it was being advocated by Richard Schweiker, who at the time was Secretary of Health and Human Services, and you decided this was not going to be something that the president should have its name on, and rather it should be a Health and Human Services, because you could see it was going to sink. So do you think it was your handling of that Social Security, which it was early in the administration, that caused Ronald Reagan to view you as his political lodestar to guide him through the political waters?
No, I don't think so. What I think the reference you made to what I said, or I guess I said it in one of these books, was that the job of the White House Chief of Staff is to navigate the intersection between politics and policy. You, by virtue of the job, you are in fact the president's political advisor when it comes to decisions involving policy. This deal was something that was cooked up by Dick Schweiker and David Stockman. Never had been vetted, never had been any discussion of it in the cabinet councils or in the cabinet discussions or anything. Even in the Oval, we hadn't talked about it. We were going to take on Social Security. Well, Social Security was, in those days, that was the third rail of politics. You touch it, you get electrocuted. And we had a president who very much wanted to do something about Social Security. We all did. But I thought it was a mistake for the president's name to be on it right out of the box, that it ought to come from HHS, from Schweiker, and the president could support it. And that's what we did. We changed it, and the president was quite happy to go along with it. We formed a Social Security Reform Commission, and we made some changes in Social Security to protect the solvency of the system for 30 years. We bumped the retirement age up a little bit, and we increased the contributions that people contributing to the system had to make. So there was something in it for Democrats, something in it for Republicans. We got it passed. In 1983, it's the last time that anybody has been successfly able to deal with Social Security. This is what I mean about Reagan was not hung up. He was not hung up on idealism at all costs. He understood the importance of getting things done, and Social Security is a good example. Tax reform is another example. We passed tax reform in 1986, last time it's been done, first time it had ever been done in 100 years, and we did it because of the Gipper, because of his leadership. We did it with Democratic votes. We had a rebellion at one point from some of the more hardline members in the House of Republican members of the House of Representatives, and President Reagan finally went up Capitol Hill and said, "Fellas, this is what I want. This is what we need to do. This is what I want done." The reason we had a rebellion was because our strategy was Ways and Means is the Committee of Jurisdiction for all tax measures, and so it had to originate in Ways and Means, and it did. But it had Dan Rostenkowski's name on it because he was chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee. So it was a Democratic bill, and our guys didn't want to vote for it, and they weren't going to vote for it. And our strategy was, "Hey, fellas, vote for this. Get it out of the House. We'll fix it in the Senate where we have a majority, and if we don't fix it, we'll veto it." Well, that wasn't good enough for some of our hardliners, and they were rebelling against their president, against President Reagan. Finally, he went up to the Hill, and Dick Cheney tells a great story about this, to talk to the House caucus there, and there'd been a terrible accident out at Fort Myers, Virginia, where a lot of our servicemen had been killed. And Reagan stands up and he spends about 30 minutes talking about this accident and the heroism of these fine young Americans who were serving their country and lost their lives and so forth. And then after about 30 minutes, he says, "Now, fellas, let's talk about that tax bill." Dick Cheney, who had been one of the rebellion members, said at that point it was all over. He said he had them, and they voted for it, and we sent it to the Senate, and we fixed it in the Senate, and we lowered the top marginal tax rate. President Reagan's 2 terms, we lowered the top marginal tax rate from 70% to 28%. Really fundamental, and that kicked off sustained non-inflationary economic growth for maybe 18 years, with 1 or 2 dips down. And that's why today we have a president who talks about tax reform, but he's not willing to do anything about it. Tax reform is a good issue to bring Democrats and Republicans together on, because you lower marginal rates, Republicans love it. You get rid of loopholes and deductions, and Democrats love it. So you pay for the lowered marginal rates by getting rid of loopholes and deductions. Our guys were rebelling against it because we were eviscerating some of our best voting blocks. We were taking out double declining balance on the real estate industry. I remember Donald Trump coming into my office in Treasury and just raising hell with me. "You're killing the real estate industry if you do this." And but anyway, it was quite an achievement. It had not been done before for 100 years, and hadn't been done since. We need a leader like Reagan to get it done.
Mm-hmm. We also need a leader like James Baker, Secretary of Treasury.
No, but I mean, We need a leader. We need a leader who's willing to go to his own troops and say, "Hey, I want to get this accomplished. No, this is not a good bill here in the House, but we're going to fix it. So please vote it out of the House. Give us a shot at it." And that's how we got it done.
Well, that leads us to a discussion or question about Reaganomics. That was obviously a big part of his domestic program to make the tax cuts, which he started as soon as he became president, that continued throughout his presidency. And definitely they succeeded in stimulating the economy. But because of his commitment to defense in large part, we were not successful in reducing the amount of spending, and the amount of deficits, according to John Meacham, quadrupled during Reagan's 8 years. So from your standpoint, was President Reagan's inability to deal with the deficit problem the biggest domestic failure of his presidency?
No, look, yeah, the deficit may have tripled or quadrupled, but they were nothing compared to what they are today. Okay, as a percentage of GDP, they were nothing compared to what they are today. We don't hear too much talk about that, but I got a request from the current president way back in 2011. Maybe this was 2010. What's the number one priority I'm facing? He asked me and Brent Scowcroft and Henry Kissinger. I think he thought I was going to come to him with a foreign policy issue about Iran or something else. I said the biggest problem you're facing, Mr. President, is our economy and the huge debt bomb that's overhanging our economy. We have a debt to GDP today of 100%. The debt to GDP was nowhere near that. Yeah, we increased the deficit because we couldn't get the Democratic House to cut spending. And we made a couple of deals, as a matter of fact, where we agreed to some tax increases against their commitment to cut spending. We never got our spending cuts. Ronald Reagan, people don't seem to realize his full 2 terms, he lived with a Democratic House of Representatives. And actually, the government, by the way, was shut down 7 times during Reagan's 2 terms, primarily by Tip O'Neill, who was at that time the titular head of the Democratic Party and the Speaker of the House of Representatives. Yes, it was too bad we couldn't get those spending cuts, but we couldn't. But the tax increases sure generated one hell of a lot of economic growth. And economic growth generates revenues, which creates jobs. And that's the whole idea behind supply-side economics, which some people condemned way back at that time as voodoo economics. I don't know who in the hell would have done that. But you know, I told people at one point, I said, yeah, I ran a campaign for George H.W. Bush in which we claimed that Reagan's economic program was voodoo economics. And then I became Reagan's Treasury Secretary, and I learned from experience I'm a reformed drunk when it comes to supply-side economics. It really worked. It really worked. It's too bad we can't capitalize on that kind of policy today.
The biggest scar on the Reagan presidency was the Irancontra scandal that happened during his 2nd term while you were the Secretary of Treasury. And to me, it shows what James Baker meant, because in Ronald Reagan's memoirs, he said that if Secretary Baker had been his national security advisor, Irancontra would not have happened. And Secretary Baker had tried to get that job, but it didn't work out. And then Nancy Reagan, in her memoir, said if Secretary Baker had stayed on as White House Chief of Staff, then Irancontra wouldn't have happened. So they're looking at 2 different jobs. If only he had had those jobs, he never would have had Irancontra. But as you watched it unfold from the Treasury, and you said you weren't seeing him every day, but obviously you were very aware of what was going on, were you ever tempted to kind of come to his rescue? Because he clearly wasn't getting good advice.
No, it was bad advice, and it's what happens anytime you have the National Security Council go operational. The National Security Council, the NSC, is designed to advise the president. It's located there in the White House. It's grown exponentially in recent years. It's way too big. But when it gets the idea that it's going to implement the country's foreign policy, then you get into trouble. That job is given to the State Department by statute. They're the ones that are accountable. They're the ones that have to go up and testify before the Congress. The NSC staff do not have to go up because they're presidential staff. And what happened was these guys got operational. They went rogue. They went over there and did a lot of this stuff. I'm convinced that Ronald Reagan didn't know about it. The testimony from the Irancontra Commission showed that. You might argue, well, he should have. There were some signs or something, but I don't know. I will tell you one anecdote. John Poindexter, at the time, Admiral John Poindexter was the National Security Council advisor. He'd taken over from McFarlane. And he was running and I was on the National Security Council as Treasury Secretary, because when I switched jobs with Don Reagan, I made sure I protected my position on the National Security Council. But Poindexter didn't invite me to those meetings. And so he came to me after all this broke. He said, "I'm really sorry I didn't invite you to those meetings." I said, "Sorry." I said, "Boy, you did me the biggest favor you could ever have done me." But it was really too bad. It was a stain on his presidency that didn't have to happen.
Now, President Reagan justifiably gets lots of credit for the way he moved the ball forward toward ending the Cold War. So give us your perspective on why Ronald Reagan was the right person, maybe the only person at that time who could change history and restore America's place in the world by the way he stepped up to the Soviet Union and reasserted American authority in the world.
Well, I think he was the right person at the right time. On the other hand, I do think that we should recognize that every American president, Democrat or Republican, from Harry Truman through George H.W. Bush, did their part in winning the Cold War. They were all steadfast in resisting Soviet totalitarianism and Soviet expansionism. So all of them deserve some credit, but Ronald Reagan gets a huge part of it because he came in after Jimmy Carter when the country's pride and confidence in itself was at a real low. He restored that pride and confidence. He rebuilt our military. He rebuilt our military to the point that the Soviets couldn't compete with it. He had Star Wars, this idea about space warfare that they were deathly afraid of because they couldn't finance it. And then he as he so often did with everything, he was such a good communicator about the issues and the importance of steadfastness in opposing the Soviets. When he went to Berlin, and said, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall," all of that was extraordinarily important. But all of our presidents deserve credit for being steadfast in the face of Soviet aggression, but Ronald Reagan was super steadfast, and so he gets a lot of credit, as well he should. Mm-hmm. George Bush gets a lot of credit too, as well he should, for the adroit way in which he managed the end game. People criticized George 41 Bush when the Berlin Wall came down. He didn't dance on the ruins of the Berlin Wall. They said, "Why aren't you showing some emotion? This is something we've been working to get here for 40 years, and you're just sort of taking it lackadaisically." Well, he knew that we still had business to do with Gorbachev and Shevardnadze, and he wasn't going to stick it in their eye.
Mm-hmm. Now, another description of your job as White House Chief of Staff was that your main responsibility was to catch javelins aimed at the president. Mm-hmm. During your 4 years, did you miss any?
Probably missed a lot of them. Probably missed a bunch of them. But that is a part of the White House Chief of Staff's job. You're semi-gatekeeper, but I'll tell you, President Reagan didn't want to be isolated or insulated. And we had a procedure when I was those 4 years that I was chief of staff. He had a post office box where anybody could write him, and they would. A lot of people would write him, and by the way, he would answer those letters in his own personal hand. Write letters back, and Martin and Annalise Anderson have a book that documents a lot of this. But he was by no means protected, or there was no Praetorian Guard around Ronald Reagan. He didn't want it, and we didn't have it. But your job is to, what you try to protect against is the "oh, by the way" decisions. You have a cabinet meeting, and on the way you're talking about something domestic, and on the way out, so one of the cabinet officers would collar the president and say, "Oh, by the way, Mr. President, I think we need this such and such and so," and our job was to kill the "oh, by the way" suggestion, which we did.
Yep. Let's move on to the presidency of George Herbert Walker Bush. You were President Bush's Secretary of State during the most tumultuous 4-year period since World War II, according to Henry Kissinger. So following up on what ultimately caused the end of the Cold War, John Meacham says that in May of 1989, you told President Bush it was, quote, time to be bold and, quote, get ahead of the power curve against Gorbachev. So my question is, what brought on that advice? What was happening that you needed to step it up?
Well, you need to understand the context, I think. We had a friendly transition because we had one Republican president succeeding another. We never had that since Martin Van Buren, I don't think. At least we'd not had an incumbent vice president win the presidency since Martin Van Buren. But you always want the president's imprimatur to be on the policies of the administration. And it was important that George H.W. Bush's imprimatur be on the foreign policy of the United States. And the most important foreign policy issue for 40 years, of course, was our relationship with the Soviet Union. So we undertook a review of the U.S.-Soviet relationship. Some people thought that we were worried that President Reagan and my pal George Shultz had been going too far with the Soviets. That's not what it was at all. This review was purely political. I hate to bust your bubble, but occasionally things are done for political reasons. and this was purely political, designed to put George Bush's imprimatur upon the nation's foreign policy. And it was successful. We got a lot of heat for dragging our feet for too long. Why aren't you engaging with the Soviets? What's the matter? And so forth. But that's the reason. That was the reason for the pause. And this was what you're quoting from was about April or May of 1989, and that's when we scheduled the first summit, the Malta summit. And when President Bush told the Defense Department in no uncertain terms, I want some bold arms control proposals. I don't want you to tell me why we can't do it. I want you to tell me how we can do it. And it turned out to be the right approach.
Mm-hmm. Now, while you had served President Reagan as White House Chief of Staff and then Secretary of Treasury, you obviously were very successful in effecting the president's policies into federal law. You became, quote, the man who made Washington work. And then upon becoming President Bush's Secretary of State, you moved into the arena of international diplomacy on a full-time basis and basically became the man who made the world work. So my question is, what was the biggest difference in playing the power game at the national level as opposed to playing it at the international level?
Not a lot at all, really. I think that negotiating skills are something that you learn. You know this in practicing law. I think negotiating skills are extraordinarily important. When you are Secretary of State, it's not unlike representing a client in a business transaction negotiation, except you're representing your country. And the same principles apply. I mean, the idea that you need to make every effort to understand what the political constraints are upon the guy across the table, that you need to the extent that you can, you need to establish a relationship of trust with that guy across the table. Keep your word so that he trusts you, and make sure he keeps his so you can trust him, so you can get things done. That doesn't mean you give up on principle. You never sacrifice your country's principles to establish a relationship of trust. But the same principles.
Well, I was watching the PBS show, James Baker, the Man Who Made Washington Work, yesterday, just to kind of prime the pump for today. And David Gergen said, national politics is like two-dimensional chess, whereas international politics is three-dimensional chess. Yeah. Is there anything to that?
Maybe 2.5-dimensional chess. I don't know, that's very precise. I'm not sure I can be as precise as David Gergen. But by the way, David Gergen worked in the first Reagan administration. He was our communications director. And his nickname at the time was Tall, because he is really tall. And so we called him Tall. He's made a career for himself as a commentator on CNN. And by the way, and teaching an extraordinarily good class in political leadership at the Kennedy School at Harvard.
Now, on June 3, 1989, the Chinese army attacked the demonstrators at Tiananmen Square while the world watched in outrage. How difficult was it for you and President Bush to contain your anger and temper your response to the Chinese leaders in order to maintain the otherwise positive relationship that you'd been developing between the U.S. and China?
Well, it wasn't too hard because, as I wrote in my book, the desk officer for the U.S.-China relationship in the presidency of George H.W. Bush was George H.W. Bush, because he'd been our first ambassador to China, and he knew China better than anybody in the administration, and certainly better than his Secretary of State did. And he had a really good feel for how to deal with the Chinese. And that was an extraordinarily difficult time, because that was a very brutal thing that they did to put down those demonstrators. And we had a lot of pressure on us to sanction China, to do all these things, and to break off the relationship. How can you sit back and do nothing when these brutes are doing this to their own people? And we did sanction them, but we kept the relationship alive, and that was George Bush more than anybody else in the administration. Brent Scowcroft, his national security advisor, who, by the way, was absolute best national security advisor. He knew the job. He'd been Ford's national security advisor. When I was named Secretary of State, he came to me and he said, "I want to tell you something." And then Bush wanted to pick him as national security advisor. He came to me, talked to me about it. I said, "I think he'd be great." Brent came to me and said, "I want to tell you something. You're Secretary of State. I am not ever going to go on television unless you tell me it's okay." Because oftentimes, in most administrations, you'll see this between the Secretary of State and the National Security Advisor, or the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Defense. We didn't have that in the Bush administration. George Bush understood foreign policy so well, and he made sure that his national security apparatus functioned the way it should have functioned. And that's why he had a very successful foreign policy presidency, in my view.
Well, 4 days after the Tiananmen Square incident, you had a very tough conversation with Chinese Ambassador Han Shu. Han Shu. It's spelled Hanxu, so I'm glad you know how to pronounce that. Now, you're famous for the 5 Ps, proper preparation prevents poor performance. That was a very tough conversation. Tell me about how you prepared for that conversation.
I don't remember. You're asking me to remember a conversation in 1989? I mean, I really don't remember, Talmage. I mean,
well, it reminded me of your conversation with David Stockman after the Atlantic Monthly, where it was just right between the eyes, read my lips.
I really shouldn't, I shouldn't say this in public, and particularly since we're webcasting this and everything, but David Stockman had been Ronald Reagan's first budget director. He was an extraordinarily talented young man from Michigan, a congressman, and he knew the budget better than anybody in the world. but he had been giving a series of private interviews. He thought they were private interviews to a guy named Bill Grider of the Washington Post, in which he said Reaganomics is a Trojan horse for reducing spending and doing all these things. And it was a very damaging interview, and and it was very hurtful, and hurtful to the president personally, but hurtful to the administration and to our policies, because it was in effect one of the insiders saying this is all a bunch of phony stuff, which it wasn't, but he was saying that. And so they wanted him fired. When I say they wanted him fired, Ed Meese wanted him fired, Mike Deaver wanted him fired, I'm sure Nancy probably wanted him fired. But I didn't want him fired because we didn't have anybody who came anywhere close to knowing the nuances of the federal budget, which is not uncomplicated, the way David Stockman did. And so I talked to the president, and President Reagan didn't like to fire anybody anyway, but I talked to him and I said, you know, we really need Stockman, and he went along with me against the others, and said, okay, we'll bring him in here and I'll read him. I said, why don't you just read him the Riot Act? So he said, okay. And so I called Stockman into my office, and I said, Stockman, I said, you are in real trouble. And I said, the rest of them want you fired around here, but the president has agreed to give some consideration to letting you stay, provided he can talk to you. And I said, so I want you, so you're going to have lunch with the president today. I'm going to apologize in advance for telling you all this. This is my exact words, you're going to have lunch with the president today. The menu is humble pie. And you're going to eat every mother effing spoonful of it. And I want to see, when you go into that Oval Office, I want to see that sorry ass of yours dragging the carpet. And so he must have been wearing a wire, because he wrote it in his book. And my mother, bless her heart, 85 years old, down here in Houston, Texas, calls me on the phone. She reads the book. She said, Jimmy, darling, you didn't say those words, did you? I said, of course not, Mother. Anyway, so we kept Stockman, but he left shortly there, maybe a couple of years.
I don't think you use those words with the Chinese ambassador. Not all those words.
No, maybe not.
Pretty strong though.
I did with the Syrian foreign minister.
Yeah.
Okay, what's next?
All right, let's talk. Let's talk about the Gulf War. You've acknowledged that the war powers, as between the president and Congress, have been a gray issue ever since the Vietnam War. And President Bush told John Meacham in his new biography, that's a New York Times bestseller, that if he had not received congressional support for the war, sending our troops into war, he would have gone ahead anyway, knowing that he would have risked impeachment by doing that. So my question is, did you and he discuss that risk of impeachment?
We didn't talk too much about the risk of impeachment, but we did talk about whether or not he would order the action, whether we got Congress's approval or not. Bear in mind now that we'd gone to the United Nations Security Council and gotten their approval, and that's, by the way, what the Obama administration was trying to follow, that model on this Iran deal that they did. But anyway, we'd gotten and it's the first time that had happened. Where the UN Security Council authorized the use of force against a member state since the UN had been organized. And so we had some powerful arguments to use with the senators and the congressmen. But even so, we barely won in the Senate 52-47. Authorizing the action to eject Iraq from Kuwait. But when we were working the issue, we could go up there and we could say to a senator, you mean you're not going to vote with the President of the United States on this, Senator, but the President of Ethiopia is going to support him? Or the President of whatever the other country would be. And it was a very powerful argument. We barely won it, but President Bush was going to do was going to do it anyway because it was the right thing to do, even if it risked impeachment.
And you were okay with that?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, when the Gulf War
Particularly having gone to the Security Council and gotten international approval, legal approval and everything for doing it, yeah, I was very much okay with it.
Yeah. Now, when the Gulf War ended, Meacham's biography says that President Bush suffered a post-combat letdown while he was also battling a thyroid condition called Graves' disease, which caused him to have an energy loss. And White House press secretary said he basically seemed to lose his zip through the presidential campaign in 92. So did you see any letdown and energy loss in President Bush after the Gulf War ended?
No, none whatsoever. I know that he had Graves' disease. I knew that at the time. But I want to tell you something about George Bush. He's about as competitive as anybody you will ever know. Very strongly competitive. And I remember in the 92 election where people said, oh, he doesn't really want it. He's not really fighting. He was working his tail off. I know, because I was sending him out there on all those events, and he would call me from the road and say, I'm ready to do another one if you want me to. So I absolutely do not believe that.
From your perspective, the 92 election was lost because of Ross Perot?
Right.
Was that the primary factor?
Got it. You got it. That's it. Well, look at it this way. We knew from our polling that Ross was taking 2/3 of his votes from us. He got 19%. Clinton got 43%. We got 38%. You take half of 19%, or 2/3 of 19%, we get 52%, something like that. So we know why we lost. Now, there was one other. We did make a big mistake in the aftermath of the Gulf War, where President Bush's numbers were in the 90s. We should have gone up in the State of the Union and proposed something for the domestic economy, which Dick Darman, who had worked for me at Treasury and at Commerce and at Treasury and in the White House for President Reagan, suggested that we come in January of '92 with a program entitled Domestic Storm. We'd been successful in Desert Storm, and it would give the country the idea we're going to focus on the domestic problems and create something around which we could build a campaign. We didn't do that. That was a mistake. Mm-hmm. We should have done that. Mm-hmm. We didn't do it. But primarily we lost because of Ross Perot. Yep. You know, same. I tell you, it also is a fact that George W. won because of Ralph Nader. I mean, if Ralph Nader hadn't been in there with as close as it was in Florida, 537 votes, Gore would have been president. So you better hope that this guy who fires people all the time doesn't decide to go out and run as an independent, or it'll tube us for sure.
Yep. Final question, and that brings in your role in the Bush versus Gore lawsuit as the quarterback of the legal team. You've had so many achievements over your amazing career in both national and international politics. If I were to say, out of your top 10, where do you rate the success in the Bush v. Gore? I mean, you talk a lot about it in your book.
Well, let me tell you an anecdote that'll answer it for you. I'm walking down the street somewhere, I can't remember where it was, and this guy walks up to me and says, I know you, you're Jim Baker. I said, that's right. He said, boy, thank you for what you've done for this country. I said, thank you very much. I was, after all, the last Cold War Secretary of State of the United States. He said, no, I mean what you did in Florida. So but I'll tell you, that was a very unique period in American politics.
Well, as you say in your book, it proved the system works.
It happened to prove the system worked, yeah, but boy, I mean, that was, people accused, at one point people said we were trying to legally steal an election. My answer to that is we were trying to legally protect an election. We were never behind in the count. All the counts had us ahead. And it was Gore that filed the challenges down there in Florida, and they made a fundamental mistake. They asked for recounts in the 4 counties that were heavily Democratic counties. That gave us the moral high ground. They said, count the votes, count the votes, count all the votes, count the votes. We said, hell, the votes have been counted. They've been counted once, twice, been counted a lot. And but it was I don't know whether we'll ever have a situation like that again, where we have the Supreme Court of the United States resolving an issue. But as I said in the book, it does prove that the system works. I would get calls during that period from heads of state of other countries, or from prime ministers or foreign ministers that I dealt with as Secretary of State, saying, "What's the matter with you? Can't you all run an election? I mean, you're supposed to be the cradle of democracy. What's going on over there?" I said, "I'll tell you what's going on. The system is working. We're working this out. It's very tense. It's very emotional, but the system's working. The rule of law is going to prevail. And I'll bet you if this was happening in your country, you might have tanks in the streets." And some of them would say, "Yeah, we might."
Tell the audience what President Clinton told you on the day that you were up there and President Bush was getting inaugurated. Mm-hmm. You remember that?
Yeah. You tell them.
Well, the comment was, "Good work in Florida."
Oh, you're talking about the one about it. He said, "Oh yeah," he said that was good in Florida. You were good, real good. He was stealing a line from Al Pacino, I think it was. You were good, real good. And he said, and I told him, Clinton was about half pissed off because the Gore people didn't use him. And he said, I told those guys that if they weren't careful,
about the Marquis of Kingsbury Rule.
Oh, that if they continued to play, this is it. If they continued to play by the Marquis of Queensberry rules, you were going to beat their brains in. We did beat their brains in.
We have time for some questions from the audience. I know we've got a lot of outstanding students here from the Baker Institute. Does anybody have a question you'd like to ask Secretary Baker about his time in either presidency? I guess while we're waiting for a hand to raise, I'll ask another question. Going back to the Reagan presidency. Oh, we do have a question. Go ahead.
Mr. Secretary.
Hey, Mark.
Account for the fact that Ronald Reagan is the icon of the Republican Party, even though there are so many things that he did and stood for that today couldn't get him nominated by the Republican Party, apparently.
Yeah, you say, why is he the icon?
Yeah.
Because he had an extraordinarily successful 2-term presidency. He's the last 2-term, no, that's not true. He's the last 2-term Republican president who's had a completely successful presidency. George W. had a 2-term presidency, but he had the problem of Iraq. And so Reagan, I think, is seen to be the ideal, the idol, the icon. Someone said to me last year, I don't understand why you Republicans focus only on Reagan. You had a hell of a president in Dwight Eisenhower. That it was very successful, and that ought to be a model for Republicans who want to become president. I tend to agree with that too. I thought Ike was terrific, but Reagan is the gold standard. And if you listen to the candidates today, I don't care where they're coming from, whether they're entertainers or whether they're politicians or whether they're outsiders or insiders, they'll all tell you they want to be a president like Ronald Reagan. Why? Because he was successful and he was good, and he told people what he was going to do, and then he did it. And he held his beliefs viscerally and deeply and fundamentally. Would he shave at the edges to get stuff done? You bet. And that's where I think he's oftentimes misunderstood. People think he was a hardcore right-wing ideologue. He wasn't.
Any other questions?
Secretary Baker, why are the Republicans having such a messy primary among all these diverse candidates, and we're not really seeing the type of leadership that
It's the way it is with the party out of power. I remember when the same thing was true on the Democratic side, although I will say this, I've never seen the phenomenon that we see today with respect to people like Trump. I mean, I think it's going to fade. My own view is it's going to fade. I happen to believe he's not going to be the nominee of our party. But the party out of power is always seen to be impotent, with no leadership, because they're in the process of picking a new leader. And we'll nominate somebody, and I think the party will, for the most part, coalesce around that nominee, because nothing concentrates the mind like being out of power for 8 years. We've been out of power for 8 years. So I'm relatively optimistic that this ought to be a Republican year, because this administration has been a disaster in my view, whether you look at it from foreign policy or domestic policy. And that's not to say I disagree with everything that's happened, but it's not been so we ought to win. But I would just say to you that this is the way it is with the party out of power. You wait until we get a nominee, and you wait until, and that's going to be, in my view, not before May, early May, late April.
Oh, wait, here's one back here.
Secretary Baker, when you were Chief of Staff to Ronald Reagan, you shared a lot of responsibilities with Ed Meese. How did that relationship complicate your ability to execute the office of Chief of Staff?
Say that again.
Sorry. When you were Chief of Staff to Reagan, you shared a lot of responsibilities with Ed Meese. How did that relationship complicate?
Meese?
Yes.
Ed Meese. Well, Ed Meese and I, there were a lot of stories when we were in that White House about tension between our two sides of the White House, but those stories were for the most part overblown. Ed Meese has been and continues to be a really good friend of mine. I put him on the Iraq study group, invited him to become a member. I also asked him to become a member of the National War Powers Commission, of which I was chairman. I was chairman of both of those. And he and I are very good, very close friends to this day. Did we have differences of view on some issues? You bet we did. But it wasn't the way the press would have you believe. And when Ronald Reagan asked me to be his Chief of Staff, the one thing he said to me was, make it right with Ed, because everybody anticipated that Ed was going to be the Chief of Staff. He'd been Chief of Staff in California. So I called him. We were out at the Century Plaza Hotel. We just won that overwhelming victory against Carter. And I said, Ed, we need to go down and sit down. And we did. Over lunch, we outlined, we had a one-page memo that we both signed and delineated what each of our responsibilities and duties would be. And for the most part, that held up quite well during the 4 years, or well, the 8 years, because Ed became Attorney General after he left the White House. I became Treasury Secretary after I left the White House. And we worked together quite closely, but we've worked together really closely since we've been out.
Well, I think besides those rumors about conflict, there were tons of stories about the Troika and how well you and Meese and Michael Deaver worked as a team.
Well, it gave the president the benefit of differing views, and that's very good. I mean, you do not serve a president. I want to tell you, Reagan used to tell, we used to tell a story about Ronald Reagan. Said, Ronald Reagan doesn't like yes men. When he says no, we all say no. But you don't do any favors. You don't do any favors to a president unless you tell him what you really think. And that's what Ronald Reagan wanted, and that's what George Bush wanted. George Bush and I, of course, had been peers here in Houston, friends for forever. He was my daughter's godfather and so forth. And I could tell him anything that I wanted and did. And the most important thing I ever told him was to get out of the race in 1980 before going to California to piss Reagan off even more. And it would have too, boy.
But you were already seeing the likelihood that he would be in the best
Well, let
position.
me tell you something. More people become president of the United States by having become vice president first than any other way. That's the best route to become president of the United States. Get to be vice president.
Mm-hmm.
And George used to say, I don't want to be vice president. I'm gonna, and I've got people that are committed to me in New Jersey and in these other states. They've been working hard, and I can't let them down. I said, are you kidding? He'll acknowledge that now.
There's a question over here.
Yeah.
In the current round of debates, we hear a lot of reform proposals from Republican candidates. And as a viewer, I sit there and say, how can you think this is going to happen as long as the filibuster rule in the Senate remains as it is? Mm-hmm. If you were advising an incoming president who had a reform agenda, what would you advise him to do with respect to Senator McConnell and the filibuster rule in the Senate?
Well, I think you have to remember that you can be in the minority just like you can be in the majority. Now we're in the majority, but there will come a time again when we will be back in the minority. And in the Senate, unfortunately, it may be in the next cycle, because we got so many seats up compared to what they got up. So you deal with that filibuster rule at your own peril. So the new president, if he could be assured of a Republican majority in the Senate, might want to lean on the majority leader to change the rule. But there are two arguments to that issue. I mean, if you're in the minority, that's the only way you can exercise power. And we're in the minority a lot. We Republicans, I would remind you, we are in the minority a lot.
Here's a question over here.
Thank you, Secretary Baker. Mr. Boston, when you mentioned that Reagan's position in winning the Cold War, I know that's very much still an open historical question in terms of to what degree Gorbachev also played a role. And Secretary Baker, you mentioned Star Wars and the Strategic Defense Initiative. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to ask you specifically on that topic, what was the kind of environment like within the administration at that time? The Soviet historical sources show that, yes, there was fear, but that there was a lot of doubt in terms of its potential effectiveness. Yeah. And also, the New York Times had a report about, this successful missile test that ended up, in White Sands or whatever, that ended up being a complete farce. They shot the missile up, and it was pretty much asking for the defense, missile defense system to come hit it, and the scientific consensus at that time was that it was impossible. Was it a fear tactic? Was that Reagan's brainchild? What were the kind of other opinions?
Well, I think it was the brainchild of some of the people that advised him in the defense community. It was a good brainchild. I mean, whether it would work or not, it sure worked as far as the Soviets were concerned, and even extended down to the time when I became Secretary of State, because they always wanted to, in arms control negotiations, they always wanted to find a way to get to our Strategic Defense Initiative and capture that, and put restraints on that. Whether we could ever have done it or not, I don't know the answer to that. I don't know the technical answer to that for sure, but the Soviets were always very concerned about it, and that was pretty much enough. The Soviet economy was deteriorating. I mean, the Soviet system was collapsing pretty much on its own, That's not to say that we didn't contribute mightily to it. We did, by remaining resolute and strong and rebuilding our defenses and resisting Soviet aggression at every turn. So, one of the big arguments we had with Gorbachev the argument about winning the Cold War. He said, you know, don't use that term. That's demeaning to us. That's very bad. That's very tough for us. For you to say you won the Cold War. Let's say that together we solved the problem of the Cold War or something like that. He didn't like that. But Gorbachev deserves a lot of the credit for the end of the Cold War, because it was Gorbachev and his foreign minister, Edward Shevardnadze, with whom I worked so closely, who made the decision not to use force to keep the empire together. Before they came on the scene, force had always been used to maintain the Soviet Empire. And they made the decision they were not going to use force to keep the empire together. And had they not done that, the Cold War certainly would not have ended peacefully the way it did.
Well, I love the way you said the Cold War ended when the Russians supported the coalition against the Iraqi army in Kuwait.
That was when I think it ended. I mean, you can argue there are a lot of places that you can say here's where the Cold War ended. To me, the Cold War ended when Saddam invaded Kuwait. Iraq was a client state of the Soviet Union. And the day after the invasion, we got the Soviet foreign minister to stand shoulder to shoulder with the American Secretary of State in an airport in Moscow and condemn the invasion. And so I write in my book, that was the day for me when the Cold War ended. Nobody would ever have dreamed that would be possible. And they stayed with the coalition. They didn't supply troops, but they didn't oppose it. And they supported a number of UN Security Council resolutions. It was really a change.
Yes, back there. Oh, wait, I'm sorry, back here.
That's all right. Thank you, Secretary Baker. You were talking about how toward the end of the Cold War, you're starting to have different types of interactions with the Soviets. Could you speak a little bit to how the environment changed in your interactions as the Cold War ended, and then
going forward? Yeah, well,
also, excuse me.
Yeah.
Also, what specific lessons on diplomacy and negotiation would you take away from that and offer to future diplomats? Thank you.
Well, here's where I think we are today. We lived with that Cold War for 40 years, and we lived with the specter of nuclear annihilation. And so nobody can be nostalgic about a return to the Cold War. But when it ended, we had a lot of cooperation. We had a administration in the Soviet Union, well, in Russia at that point, who really wanted to work with the West. They leaned in our direction for 15 years. So when people say, you didn't really win the Cold War because look what Putin's doing today, that's wrong. Even Putin himself, he came to the Baker Institute, his picture's right out there on the wall speaking, and said all these nice things about America. That doesn't happen anymore. And it doesn't happen primarily because he has found that the best way to solidify his political power domestically is to point fingers at an outside enemy. A lot of political leaders do that. We made some mistakes, in my opinion. If you think back to the way we treated Germany and Japan after World War II, with the Marshall Plan and all that, we made friends out of enemies. And America has had no better friends in the 60-plus years, or whatever it is, since World War II ended, than Germany and Japan, particularly Japan. We didn't do that with Russia. What did we do with Russia? Well, we said we're going to put a missile defense system in Poland and Czechoslovakia, and Russia said that's designed against us. Don't do that. We said no, it's not designed against you. It's designed against Iran. And they said, oh, well, if that's the case, we'd like to be a part of it, and we'll pay our share. And we said, oh, no, you can't do that. Well, I'm not excusing in any way what Putin has done, rolling the tanks into Crimea. You do not roll the tanks, okay? Even if you don't like what's going on in your neighbor. But that was not a very wise approach for us to take, in my view. They were a vanquished enemy. We could have said, oh, well, fine, you want to be a part of it? Come on, you pay your share. What else did we do? Well, we said, we're going to expand NATO, and we're going to keep expanding and expanding and expanding and expanding and expanding it. And in fact, we're going to take some of the former republics of the former Soviet Union and make them NATO members, like Ukraine. Well, Ukraine, that would almost be like if they'd won the Cold War, making California a part of the Warsaw Pact. I mean, it's not a good idea. NATO's terrific, and we ought to. It was wonderful. The Baltics should be in NATO. That we never acknowledged their as being part of the Soviet Union. But we went too far and we went too fast. We didn't have to do it. We're talking about Georgia. Well, I'm sympathetic to the Georgians being in NATO because the Russians tend to lean on them overly heavily. But we made those mistakes. That doesn't justify in any way what he's done, not in any way. And so we need to be strong with him and we need to be firm. But we made our share of mistakes, I think, in winning the peace. We won the Cold War, but we didn't win the peace the way we did with Germany and Japan. Now you can say, well, when did that happen? Well, it happened primarily during the Clinton and subsequent administrations. But that was U.S. policy. And that was our policy too. I don't deny that in the first Bush administration. But we never actually got to the point of implementing it. But I'm not sure it was the right policy. That's all I'm saying.
Sure. Well, our time is up. You've obviously been a wonderful audience, very attentive. So glad so many students were able to join us. Thank you so much, Secretary Baker, for sharing your insights.